How's it going, everybody? So we have a fun review today as we're talking The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim. These days, as a Lord of the Rings fan, you kind of are going into pretty much every single project, flipping a coin as far as the quality of the project, whether it be the Shadow of War and Mordor video games, the Gollum video game, the Rings of Power. Pretty much it's essentially a toss-up going into every single project as far as fans, how they feel about the project. And yet either way, because I'm a big fan of this franchise, I'm always tuned in. Set over 100 plus years before the events of the original trilogy of films, a sudden attack by Wolf, a clever and ruthless lord seeking vengeance for the death of his father, forces Helm Hammerhand, the king of Rohan, and his people to make a daring last stand in the ancient stronghold of the Hornsburg. Admittedly, though I am a fan of the franchise, the central story within this prequel and several of the characters in it aren't ones that I'm overly familiar with. But my interest was certainly piqued going into this prequel to learn all of the lore surrounding them, the inevitable founding of Helm's Deep. Plus, I mean, the animation style they employed here also piqued my interest. Though we've seen Lord of the Rings animated before, it hasn't been done in this style. So as a longtime fan of animation, that certainly did add to all of my interest. The blending of this style of animation, coupled with Kenji Kamayama's direction, makes for a pretty stunning return to Middle-earth. It's undeniable that the War of Rohirrim does have many of those qualities that makes the multitude of the stories within Middle-earth so entertaining. There are some parts in the story that I wasn't overly fond of, which I will get into a little bit later, but the story expands the lore deeper in some really interesting ways. In some sense, there's a bit of beauty and tragedy to all of the different ebbs and flows throughout the story, some of which is focused around empowerment for some of these characters. Because I am somebody that watches a lot of anime, the action spectacle of it all was what I was really hoping would be epic for the War of Rohirrim, especially applying that style to Lord of the Rings and Kenji Kamayama's background, which if you aren't aware of his background already, he worked on a lot of various different projects revolving around Ghost in the Shell. The all-around cinematic scope of the animation here is simply breathtaking, even outside of just the battles and action in general. I love the overall design for everything, the characters, the creatures, all of that stuff is completely mesmerizing and helped me enrich myself in this universe even deeper. With a title like The War of Rohirrim, you are going into this expecting some big, grand spectacle, and on that front, I definitely feel like this film delivers that. There's quite a lot of epic action sequences, several of which are very much in line with the Lord of the Rings universe, of course, but some other types of battles as well, like hand-to-hand combat and stuff like I was not expecting in Lord of the Rings. All I'll say is by the time we get into the third act, some of these battles get a bit more wild than even I was anticipating. Now when it comes to the characters in the Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, that is one of the parts I am fairly mixed upon, because in my opinion, only a small handful of these characters were all of that memorable. Don't get me wrong, the voice cast that they assemble here is pretty great. I don't know what this says about me as a fan of Lord of the Rings or just fantasy in general, but Wolf probably was my favorite character, the antagonist of the movie. All around, he's just this badass, compelling antagonist that fuels many of the best thrills of the movie and the action. Going in, I knew somewhat about Helm Hammerhand. If I remember correctly, he is someone that you face in Shadow of War. By the way, Helm Hammerhand is such an amazingly cool name. I don't think you could get more badass than that. Many of his scenes made me wish that the story was far more focused on his character, as he's a surprisingly cool but tragic king. Seeing him in all these different action sequences, though, that was pretty cool. I mean, that hammer alone is probably one of the best parts of this movie. You can definitely see why out of everything they could have chosen for a popcorn bucket for this film, they chose to make it out of that hammer, which I am definitely going to be picking up as fast as I can. I don't know what I'm going to do with it afterwards, display it, use it to knock people's phones out their hands in the theater if they're talking or singing. Considering, though, the fact that his daughter is kind of the main focus of the movie, I wish that I liked her character a little bit more. The focus around her is kind of a double-edged sword, as it does have some decent sequences, because we go on this journey of growth with her, and her attempting to lead the charge, come into her own and discover herself. But it's an arc that we've seen time and time again, and it is just very stereotypical the way that it plays out. I figured as much when people were talking about it online, that her character, her backstory, for the most part, is kind of just built up for the movie, which certainly does make sense after you watch the film, as they're trying to incorporate her as best as they can to kind of emulate Tolkien's style, but I was more so mixed by the end. Thankfully, because of the fact that many people in this universe live for hundreds upon hundreds of years, they are able to incorporate characters that we would know from the original trilogy in this, not like significant roles or anything, so they're more so cameos than anything else. If you've been following the news centered around this movie, you would at least know some of these cameos. The biggest one one, of course, is the return of Christopher Lee voicing Saruman. That one was the coolest one to me. That was the one that really got me. Not only was it just really cool to see how he was incorporated and getting to hear Christopher Lee voice the character again using unused lines of dialogue, one of those rare times where I felt like it was somewhat justified here. These days it has kind of become a trend within Hollywood to digitally resurrect actors. We see it done so regularly nowadays, it kind of just has become the norm. Whether that be Peter Cushing in Rogue One, Christopher Reeves in The Flash, or the most recent one I can think of, ironically, is Ian Holm when he came back in Alien Romulus. Here at least it didn't overstay its welcome. I thought it was just a nice little tidbit of nostalgia. Now it does feel kind of cliche to say this about Lord of the Rings media. As someone that's a Lord of the Rings fan, I've heard it time and time again from other people, but I have to admit that this movie does very much feel way too long. There are many points in the movie where you definitely feel that 2-hour plus runtime, largely due to how the film in general is paced. Like I said earlier, it's not helped by the fact that some of these characters are not all that interesting, so my interest did start to wane as the story went on. It does pick up at least a little bit by the end, but there are certain sections here that are very slow. All around, The Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim is a pretty solid new entry within the franchise. The grand scale of the animation adds many fun new dynamics into the mix for Middle-earth, with a journey that I think most fans should enjoy, along with others who may not be aware of what the tale of this prequel has to offer. Among the multitude of different media we've had for this franchise for the last several years, I think this might be my personal favorite over like the Rings of Power and of course the Gollum game. I mean, that game was terrible, but I feel like if you're a hardcore fan of this material, this will be something up your alley. It offers something different, of course, also because of the fact that it is animated. Now, I don't know how well this will do box office wise or awards wise, because that might be a little bit tricky, but as far as general enjoyment goes, I'm hopeful that for the most part fans will like this project. But make sure you share your thoughts down below. Once you get a chance to check out Lord of the Rings, The War of the Rohirrim, what did you think of the film? Did you like the movie? Did you not like the movie? Show your thoughts down below. And thank you guys, as always, for checking out the videos. I always do appreciate it. Make sure you like on the video and also subscribe to the channel if you haven't already to update reviews, reactions, unboxings, and more. But next time, I'll see you guys later.